Does the Prime Minister understand? There is a growing feeling of anger in this country that we are living through two-tier policing and a two-tier justice system. The presentation of what the American administration believes is a fantasy. Joe Biden is going. In fact, many think he's gone already. We will not stop the boats, even if we send a handful to Rwanda. We will not stop the boats by attempting to smash the criminal gangs. We've been doing that to the drugs industry in Britain year after year, decade after decade, with no success whatsoever. The financial rewards for smuggling people across the English Channel can now net a gang 2 to 3 million euros a week.
I was half expecting to see him on the immigration statistics when we see the next back.
As Speaker, so we absolutely endorse you entirely for this job. And it is, I must say, in marked contrast to the little man that was there before you and besmirched the office so dreadfully, in doing his best to overturn the biggest democratic result in the history of the country. We support you, sir, fully. It's worth reminding ourselves that net migration was the same during the late 1940s, the whole of the 1950s, the whole of the 1960s, the whole of the 1970s, the whole of the 1980s, and the 1990s up until Mr. Blair. Net migration had run at 30 to 50,000 a year for over half a century. Then Mr. Blair gets in and decides we're going to open the doors in a way that had never been done before, to the delight and joy of big companies and especially giant multinationals who have always wanted as much cheap labour as they can get, and to hell with the consequences for working class families and people. But perhaps it was even more of a surprise to see that that massive acceleration in our population through immigration would then by a Conservative Party who, despite promises in 4 consecutive manifestos, actually accelerate what had happened under the years of Mr. Blair. And so we see a population increase of 10 million people since that time that Labour won its last landslide. Even the net figure is a migrant a minute. Even during the course of this debate, many hundreds more people will come to our country. And nobody is making the argument that there aren't some exceptionally wonderful people among them. There are, of course. But the sheer level of population means we have to build a new house every 2 minutes, even if the Labour government is able to fulfil the 1.5 million houses that it wants to build during the lifetime of this Parliament. It will make no dent at all on the current shortage of housing. Rents have risen by 25% since 2021. Why? Population increase and pressure. And the list goes on through access to health services, to congestion, to pressure on infrastructure. The population crisis is the biggest impact affecting people's lives, damaging their quality of life, and virtually nobody in this place even wants to talk about it. But perhaps it's on illegal immigration that I do really want to make a point. 4 years ago, I went out into the English Channel repeatedly, filming dinghies coming across the channel, dinghies with an average of 16 people per boat. I was described as being a sad, lonely, desperate figure, always seeking attention. And I've no doubt there are some that think that's still the case today.
Spot on.
Thank you. But I did it because it was obvious to me what was going to happen. It was obvious that there would be a huge influx of people illegally coming to Britain across the English Channel, and it would happen because we'd stopped deporting people who came to Britain illegally. And perhaps the Labour Party might want to reflect themselves on the last period of Labour government, where we had Home Secretaries like David Blunkett, far, far to the right of people like the Shadow Home Secretary today. You came to Britain illegally During the last Labour government, your feet didn't touch the sides. You were gone, you were out. Indeed, in the last year of the Labour government, from 2009 to 10, 50,000 people who came here illegally were deported. Now, none of that happens anymore. It didn't happen under 14 years of Conservatives, and it clearly isn't going to happen under this Labour government. And I wonder why. I think you'll find it's the increased role of a court overseas that was set up in the wake of World War II with the very, very best of intentions that has now completely outlived its usefulness. It is, of course, called the Echr, the European Court of Human Rights, and it was the Labour government that enshrined the Convention into British law. We will not stop the boats, even if we sent a handful to Rwanda. We will not stop the boats by attempting to smash the criminal gangs. We've been doing that to the drugs industry in Britain year after year, decade after decade, with no success whatsoever. The financial rewards for smuggling people across the English Channel can now net a gang 2 to 3 million euros a week. Whatever prison sentences or penalties are put upon them, there will always be people volunteering to make millions of euros a week. We will only stop this if we start deporting people that come illegally. Then they won't pay the smugglers. But we'll only do that by leaving the Echr. But I've got a fun suggestion that I think would liven up politics, engage the public, and see a massively increased turnout. Why don't we have a referendum on whether we continue to be members of the Echr?
I have seen the effect of stillbirth in my own family, and yeah, it's pretty devastating. It doesn't go away. It doesn't get forgotten. But there's another element to this, which is for those people, particularly the women that go through this, are they able to talk about it? Can they share their experiences? And a problem shared may not be a problem solved, but it might just make life a little bit more bearable, a little bit easier. I must be honest, when my niece had that stillbirth, I didn't feel I could face her and talk about it. I felt too awkward. Would I say something that was wrong? Was it best we just didn't discuss the subject? And a decade on, even though I'm close to her, I've never discussed it. I've just felt too awkward to do it. And I suspect that's the case with many men. I suspect with husbands and partners, just something that isn't talked about. And so I do want to pay tribute to Councillor Jeff Bray, former leader of Tendring District Council, who has, as a father that went through the stillbirth experience, talked about it. And I'm encouraged that in Clacton that Maria Gormley has got a charity where women, and men if they want to, can come together on a regular basis and share their experiences and talk about it. And it's not an easy thing to do, and I've admitted my own failings, but I suspect I am far from alone in finding this subject just incredibly difficult. So I think the fact we're having this conversation, I think the fact, Lee, that anything that can be done to prevent avoidable disasters must be done. But I do just urge, I want to put on the record, that naturally these things will happen, hopefully in very few numbers, and there does need to be the counselling and the support for people that have been through that experience, which I feel, to be honest, in most parts of the country is really very sadly lacking. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
But given the money we've given to the French, we no longer accept escorts from the French Navy. The day after 12 people died in the Channel, the day after, there was a French naval vessel escorted a dinghy from a couple of hundred yards off Wissant all the way to our 12-mile line. No more French naval escorts, I think, is vital. So we need political will, and the Germans, of course, are now showing it. The Germans will ignore the Echr. The Germans, by the way, sent a plane back full of young men to Afghanistan the other week. So with political will, with leaving the Echr, we can solve this. And I would just promise the Labour government one thing. This issue caused great pain to the Conservative Party, and it impacted in the general election. This issue of illegal migration and the crime that it leads to, which is a conversation that's barely started in this country, but a conversation that in France and Germany is now very big.
will do massive damage to Labour's electoral chances. You're going to have to get tough, and I'm afraid your leader is going to have to rethink his position on the ECHR. Thank you.
Yesterday we witnessed some extraordinary celebratory scenes outside Britain's prisons where in some cases serious career criminals were released. And this to make way for, yes, rioters, but equally those who've said unpleasant things on Facebook and elsewhere on social media. Does the Prime Minister understand there is a growing feeling of anger in this country that we are living through two-tier policing and a two-tier justice system?
I'm angry to be put in a position of having to release people who should be in prison because the last government broke the prison system. And the Prime Minister was repeatedly warned. He had his own release scheme. He was repeatedly warned that he had to adopt the scheme that we've put in place. The former Justice Minister said if we don't do it, we'll have to get down on our knees and pray. The police chiefs made it absolutely clear in a letter to him before the election that he needed to take action, saying that they wouldn't be able to discharge their duties and saying the risk was loss of an ability to detain suspects. That means, Mr Speaker, an inability to arrest people committing offences. That's how bad it was, and they warned the Leader of the Opposition that further delays until after the general election will increase the risk significantly. What did he do? He delayed and increased the risks.
The potential judgment, next judgment of a spurious, rather political foreign court matters more than the issue of national sovereignty. But and you boast that President Biden likes this deal. Now, the Speaker earlier on said that this House should not be affected by elections that take place in foreign countries. But I wonder how confident are you if the 47th President of the USA becomes Donald Trump that he will approve of this deal, given the importance of our relationship with America?
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for his question. Let me reassure him that we have sought to take views across the US political establishment. But I do say to him, to get a US president, a US Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs and Defence applaud this agreement should reassure him that the US would do nothing that would help our enemies, particularly the Chinese, in this regard.
Since the mistaken opening of negotiations by the last government on the sovereignty of the Chagos Islands, it turns out the British High Commissioner and others appear to have been bugged by the government of Mauritius. If the police investigation into this proves to be true, and we can see that Mauritius, their government at least, are bad actors, in the light of that, is the 99-year-old lease that you got on Diego Garcia even worth the paper that it's written on?
Well, of course, we note the reports with significant concern, but the honourable gentleman would understand that I'm not going to comment on an ongoing police investigation. As I pointed out yesterday, these obviously relate to historical conversations, not during the current round of negotiations, and we're absolutely confident that we've achieved a treaty that meets both our national security objectives, closes off a migration route, but also fundamentally respects the interests of Chagosian people.
But economically, I sat listening to the numbers thinking this budget is illiterate. I don't know who's doing the sums, whether perhaps it's the Right Honourable Member for Hackney North, but the sums do not work. And the markets now agree with me, because just in the last couple of hours, we've seen a very substantial spike in gilt yields. We're not quite yet back to 2022 with that mini budget, but clearly people are saying this isn't going to work. And even more concerning, I suppose, is that the new head of the Office for Value for Money, David Goldstone, has served for many years on the board of HS2, which I would suggest is the very opposite of value for money.
This point of order will be relevant. Can you confirm it's going to be relevant?
It is relevant, Madam Deputy Speaker. The honourable gentleman mentioned the member for Hackney north. I just wondered whether he had actually warned her that he was going to be mentioning her in the chamber.
I thank the honourable member for the point of order. However, that is not a point of order. It is a courtesy of the House. Nigel Farage.
Nice try. I was just gently teasing, that was all. Invest, invest, invest is what we heard at the start of this budget speech, and I thought, yes, that's what we need, absolutely. Not just the big multinationals that come to smart conferences, but equally, hundreds of thousands of people putting their own risk capital into start-ups, into new businesses. But no, this invest, invest, invest is going to be done by the Chancellor on our behalf. Not just a top economist at the Bank of England, but she's now going to be the fund manager of the nation, investing money and trying to pick winners. And I would suggest the last time governments attempted back in the 1970s to invest money and pick winners, it ended very badly indeed. I will give way.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, and I just question, when he talks about investment in our country and in businesses, whether he'd prefer to have investment from our government or whether he'd prefer to have investment from maybe the Russian government.
Maybe one or two members of the House ought simply to grow up, but there we are. It's a bit sad. And I've worked in private business myself, and I do wonder, I do think picking winners is wrong. I think we leave this to the free market, and we let people either make money or we let them lose money. And frankly, if they do their dough, well, that's just the way these things work. Any business employing 5 or more people has today been hammered. And I make the point that I've set up companies and run companies. Nobody on the front bench has ever worked in private business. Nobody on the front bench understands what genuine risk capital is. Our business secretary, from what I can make out, has never even had a job. But the most dismal part, no, I've had plenty of jobs. Well, apart from being in the European Parliament, which doesn't really count, obviously. But I got to tell you, what is dismal about this budget is the growth forecast. If the ambition of our Chancellor is that in 4 years' time growth should be 1.5%, that is very, very bad news for everybody, and particularly because it takes no account of the rise in population that will happen through legal immigration. It basically means a rise of zero. And nobody's even mentioned today the fact that gross domestic product per capita, wealth per capita, has been falling consistently nearly every single quarter for the last 2 years. The bigger our population becomes, the poorer we are becoming. And that's a reality we've got to wake up to. But I would say this. The big picture is we're in decline. We're getting poorer. There isn't a £22 billion black hole. That's nonsense. It's 2.7 trillion. Our debt repayments are 90 billion a year. And from all the figures I've seen today, that will be worse in 5 years' time than it is today. We need a complete change of culture. We need to start saying success is a good thing. Making money is a great thing. People becoming rich is something we should encourage. We've got to change our culture of work. The idea that, oh yes, work from home, do a 4-day week, get your work-life balance right. Well, you know what, actually, why don't we say to people, young people, hard work is a good thing. Yeah. Hard work is the only way anybody succeeds individually. And hard work is the only way we're going to have a chance as a country to turn any of this around. We're in much deeper trouble. And much more... now, you keep on going. Please sit down, honestly. You've had a go. We are in much deeper trouble than anybody on either front bench dares to admit. It's a reality we should all face. And I have to say that, for a Labour Party that couldn't define what a woman was, couldn't define what a working person was, well, after today, I'm pretty convinced they can't define what economic growth is. Thank you. I'm sure the Prime Minister and the whole House would wish to congratulate Donald Trump on his landslide victory last week. Is that...
Hold on. I will hear the question. Nigel.
Thank you. But within a couple of days, we'd learned of a third assassination attempt Charges have been laid, and behind it are Iran's Revolutionary Guards. Has the time not come, Prime Minister, to prescribe what is so obviously a terrorist organisation, and in doing so, not just do the right thing, but maybe mend some fences between this government and the incoming presidency of Donald Trump's, given that the whole of his cabinet have been so rude about him over the last few years?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to see the honourable member making a rare appearance back here in Britain. He spent so much time in America recently. I was half expecting to see him on the immigration statistics when we see him back. But he may have missed. I did congratulate the incoming president last week. And we will work with him. The point he makes about Iran is a very serious point, and we will work across the House and with our allies on it. Obviously, on question of prescription, we keep them under review. Thank you.
Mauritius has no legal or historical claim to the sovereignty of a group of islands that are 1,300 miles away from where it is. Nor does, from the International Court, it was purely an advisory opinion. There is no legal reason why we have to do any of this. Now, I warned the Foreign Secretary 6 weeks ago in this chamber that it was an enormous mistake to do this, given that we had a US presidential election coming up on November the 5th. And if you say to me, well, yes, it's okay, the United States are fully in favour, really? I can tell you that the incoming National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, has form on this, right back to when the Right Honourable Member for Braintree was doing his best to give away the sovereignty of the Chagos Islands. Indeed, he wrote to Secretary of State Blinken at the time. There is, I can assure you, having been in America last week, knowing also the incoming Defence Secretary very well, there is outright hostility to this deal. Whatever is said about a lease agreement, as we saw with Hong Kong, these agreements can very, very easily be broken. Diego Garcia was described to me by a senior Trump advisor as the most important island on the planet as far as America was concerned. So you're going to find outright hostility. And by the way, when it comes to the Chagosian people, yes, of course, what happened to them was truly awful. They do not wish to live. They're unanimous in this. They do not wish to live under Mauritian rule. They want to live under British rule because they actually trust us. There is no basis for this agreement to continue as it is, and if you do, you'll be at conflict with a country without which we would be defenceless.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm afraid, obviously, I fundamentally disagree with what the honourable gentleman has had to say. Let me be absolutely clear. This government inherited a situation where the long-term secure operation of this crucial military base, he is right on that one point, was under threat. International courts were reaching judgments, international organisations were taking steps not to undermine Mauritian sovereignty, and this threatened the secure and effective operation of the base. And in the absence of a negotiated solution, a legally binding decision against the UK seemed inevitable. This would have threatened the secure and effective operation of the base, and that was not sustainable. I note the comments he makes regarding the incoming US administration. We're looking very forward to working with them, and I'm sure that they will be being briefed on the full detail of this deal. And I am confident, Mr. Speaker, that the details of this arrangement will allay any concerns. We would have not entered into any such arrangement in the first place.
Mr. Francois, I welcome you back to the front bench, but I don't welcome you back to shout from it continuously. Do we understand that we need calm? This is an important debate, so I don't want the rhetoric coming from the Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I've known the honourable gentleman a long time, and he knows he can come and speak to me at any point. No, absolutely, Mr. Speaker, but he can come and speak to me about these matters at any point. Mr. Speaker, we were very, very clear. The US administration that's incoming, we will be working very closely. We're working closely with the current US administration. This had support across the the national security apparatus of the United States, we would never have entered into an arrangement. And indeed, of course, the previous government recognised the threats to the long-term operation of this base, which is why they started the negotiations in the first place. But it was this government that did the deal. Diego Garcia is absolutely important, but it is not at risk. It is more secure as a result of this deal. So what he is suggesting is simply not the case. He mentions the Chagosians. We all agree what happened to them in the past was completely wrong and shameful. That's been agreed on all sides of the House. I've engaged with the Chagosian community on a number of occasions. He will also recognise, Mr Speaker, that there are a range of views across the Chagosian community, including those who support this deal. But we've made sure that their interests are at the heart of this arrangement, whether it's in the trust fund, whether it's in the unilateral arrangements that we will do, the continued commitments to UK citizenship for Chagosians, and of course their ability to return, Mr Speaker, in terms of visits to all the islands and to a part of a resettlement programme that Mauritius will restart as a part of this treaty. So I am confident this deal is the right thing for our national security, it's the right thing for the Chagosian community, and it's the right thing for our allies and partners.
The presentation of what the American administration believes is a fantasy. Joe Biden is going. In fact, many think he's gone already. I have been contacted by very senior officials and advisers from the incoming Republican administration, and every single one of them is appalled at this deal. They know the leasehold agreement will not survive, just as the deal with China over Hong Kong didn't survive. Hasn't the time come for the government to admit this is a rotten deal for the UK, a rotten deal for America, and an even worse deal for the Chagosians? And if you care so much about the sovereignty of the Falklands being in the hands of the Falkland Islanders, why not have a referendum of the Chagosians and ask them to settle who should have sovereignty over those islands?
Well, as someone who's been in the Falklands recently, let me say that whipping up uncertainty of the future of the Falklands is not helpful for the security of the Falkland Islanders. Let's be absolutely clear. The Falklands are British for as long as the people of the Falkland Islands want to be British. When it comes to this deal, I'm certain that when the detail of the deal has been put before this House and before our US friends and other allies, they will see that the deal secures not only the future of the UK-US base, something that is not the case until this deal was signed, but secures it well into the next century, where he and I will no longer be in this place, but the UK-US base will be on Diego Garcia, still operating, securing our national interests.
But if I also look at 2023, I see that asylum claims were 84,000 people. Everyone talks about the small boats, and yet 69% of that 84,000 did not come across the English Channel in boats. Can she tell me, please, where did they come from? Were they overstayers? Were they student visas? Who were the 69%?
From what?
Well, we are clear that net migration needs to come down after the huge increase. We also need to restore order to the asylum system. Part of that is going after the criminal gangs who are undermining border security and putting lives at risk and tackling the small boat crossings. But there is also an issue about the increases that we have seen around in-country asylum applications, and we have instigated a review into the increase in-country asylum applications to get to the bottom of what is happening and why. There were two areas where we found that the previous government's decision to remove visa requirements for visitors had led to a significant increase in asylum applications for people who were coming as visitors instead. We have reversed those changes that were made by the previous Conservative government and reintroduced visitor visa requirements for those countries.
John Slinger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've just returned hot foot from a very full Mar-a-Lago. And I've spoken to several members, senior administrators especially, of the incoming administration who will be in the White House in 32 days' time. Let me assure you, there is very deep disquiet amongst all of them as to what this may mean for the long-term future of Diego Garcia and whether such deal would hold, given the precedent of the deal break over Hong Kong. They also can't understand why we would surrender the sovereignty of these islands on an advisory judgment from a pretty obscure court. But this is about sovereignty, and you keep saying yourself that the sovereignty...
Order. No, we can't both stand. When you say you mean me. I am having no ownership of this decision. Right?
Fair enough. Fair enough. Can we please, if we respect the sovereignty of Gibraltar and the Falkland Islands on the basis it's what the people want, can we have a referendum of all of the eligible Chagosians and let them decide what the future sovereignty of the Chagos Islands is? That surely is the only fair solution.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we've been very clear that these were negotiations between the United Kingdom and Mauritius, and I've set out in the past the reasons for that. The interests of the Chagosians are absolutely at the heart of this agreement. As I said, I've repeatedly engaged with them. And I do find, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman continues to speculate. With the greatest respect, he does not know the detail of what is agreed. He doesn't know the detail that has been shared. He doesn't know, Mr. Speaker, the detail that the national security apparatus of the United States has considered, and I am confident, Mr. Speaker, that he would have his concerns allayed when he sees the detail of this deal.
Dr. Andrew Murray.